All right, you can begin my time. Ladies and gentlemen, it's indeed an honor to be before you tonight for the final negative speech of this debate. I want to thank everybody for being here for this debate. Several ministers have been here both nights. Thank you. Some have driven long distances. It's good that I had my wife and my family here with me this time. Sometimes my wife is not able to come with me to these debates, and she's a good support for me at this. She's a strength to me. I appreciate Brother Carroll for being here, taking time. He's a great friend of mine. He now pastors. If you ever want to have I've announced one time over a pulpit that he was the flamethrower of truth. Well, if you want some anointed preaching, you call up Brother Carroll. He's there. There's 3 John Carrolls in Pentecost. There's John Carroll the prayer, John Carroll the scholar, and then there's a John Carroll, what do you call him, the good-looking one? So there's make sure you get John Buddy Carroll. So anyway, thank you, Pastor Neely, for hosting these debates. I'm going to get right into this. Brother Hayes, in his chart 68, he talked about, you want to find out a woman's submission, you get her to wear a head covering. No, my wife's submission is not in the fact that she wears a veil on her head. My wife's submission to me, she's got her covering on right now. My wife's submission to me is the fact that she doesn't cut her hair. You get the scissors out of your hair, then you'll show your real submission to your head, to your husband. He talked about the Pentecostal meeting from 1932, picture of them wearing hats. I could show you Pentecostal meetings of men back in the early 1900s, and they all had beards. Styles change. You don't know if those women were wearing hats because they thought it was a covering or because that was simply the style. The other one where they have long hair, that is their covering. If they had long hair, that was their covering, not a hat that was on top of their head. His chart 69, he brought up bra burning and the National Organization of Women. I guess that was some kind of argument he just had to get off of his chest. But if he's going to quote the NOW organization as his scholarly opinion on the issue of head coverings, he might as well quote a liberal like Nancy Pelosi. So then he got into Comey. And what he did tonight is what he did last night. He got mixed up last night on Greek word. He kept saying epikaleo in the middle voice, and it wasn't epikaleo. The word Comey is not the argument that I used about uncut hair. What I used was the verb kamao. Well, if I could get the number lock back on. Hold my time just for a second. There we go. Thank you. All right, so the argument was not the noun Comey, it was the verb kamao, have long hair. It's a present active subjunctive verb. It's called a progressive present tense. It denotes a continuous action. If a woman allows her hair to continuously grow long. I showed you from several lexicons. Bauer-Danker lexicon defined kamao. We're not talking about Comey, talking about the verb if a woman has long hair. We think of long hair in that term as a verb and a noun, but it's all one verb in Greek. Kamao, have long hair. That's the phrase. Bauer-Danker lexicon says it means to wear long hair, let one's hair grow long. Thayer's lexicon said it means to let the hair grow, have long hair. I quoted all of these last night. He didn't mention anything about it. He wasted all of his time talking about church history. Friedrich Friesike, he was a German scholar of the Greek papyri. He said that the phrase, let the hair grow out, means to wear one's hair uncut. Lou and Nita, who are not apostolic. They were not members of the UPC, the ALJC, the RESPECT, any organization. Lou and Nita said, in a number of languages, it may be necessary to translate kamao as to let one's hair grow long or not to cut one's hair. That's not Jason Weatherly, that's Lou and Nita. Just to show you that this is not something that's limited to Pentecostal organizations. Schaff Herzog, Philip Schaff was a Presbyterian. Herzog was a German Protestant. They said women never cut their hair. Long hair was the greatest ornament. 1 Corinthians 11:15. John Gill, who was an English Baptist, his comments on 1 Corinthians 11:15. If a woman have long hair and wears it without cutting it, as men do. You want to find out who's under submission to their husband, ask your wife not to cut her hair anymore, because that's the sign of submission. Philip Brown, who is a professor of languages at a Bible college in Cincinnati, Ohio, he translated 1 Corinthians 11:6, if a woman does not have uncut hair. Paul Butler, he was a disciple of Christ Christian Church. He said the expression long hair means let the hair grow. Hair is either the natural length or it's not. We either let our hair grow or we do not. We either cut it or we do not. John Rice was an independent Baptist. He was the founding editor of the Sword of the Lord. On 1 Corinthians 11:15, he said, God does not say how many inches long the hair should be. He simply indicates that it should be uncut. E.M. Zur from the Church of Christ Campbellites. He was a contributor to Truth magazine. He said, if a woman cuts any of her hair, she ceases to have long hair. So this understanding that kama'o, or have long hair, refers to uncut hair. It is not a UPC exclusive teaching. It's not a Oneness Pentecostal exclusive teaching whatsoever. So Brother Hayes brought up A.T. Robertson in his comments from 1 Corinthians 11:15 that it is not in the place of a veil, but answering auntie in the sense of auntie from John 1:16. Now I want to show you something else about A.T. Robertson here. Either A.T. Robertson talked out of both sides of his mouth, or Brother Hayes totally misunderstood what A.T. Robertson talked about. Because in his large grammar, he said the idea of in the place of, or instead, comes where two substantives placed opposite to each other are equivalent and so may be exchanged. And one of the examples he gave was 1 Corinthians 11:15. The idea of exchange also appears in 1 Corinthians 11:15. What do the Greek scholars say about auntie? Abbott Smith Manual Lexicon says instead of, in place of, 1 Corinthians 11:15. Balls and Schneider Exegetical Lexicon says this accounts for the meaning of instead of, in the place of, for the benefit of. Then they give several examples of how auntie is used, such as Luke 11:11. We talked about that last night. A serpent instead of a fish. Balls and Schneider go on to say the idea of exchange or substitution might also be present in John 1:16, 1 Corinthians 11:15. Sake Kubo, Greek English Lexicon, 1 Corinthians 11:15, auntie, instead of, in place of. Edward Robinson, auntie of substitution, in place of, instead of. Remember all those translations I showed you that translated auntie, 1 Corinthians 11:15, as in lieu of a veil, in place of a covering, instead of. I showed you at least 4 interlinears that translate it. Long hair is given to her instead of a covering. Brother Hayes has totally misunderstood what A.T. Robertson was saying in his word pictures. Joseph Thayer defined the term as auntie, indicating exchange, succession for, instead of, in place of, universally instead of, to serve as a covering, 1 Corinthians 11:15. So when Thayer says to serve as a covering, he has the idea of exchange, instead of, in place of. W.E. Vine, defining the word auntie, said in the majority of occurrences in the New Testament, the idea is that of in the place of, instead of exchange. The ideas of substitution and exchange are combined. For example, Luke 11:11, for a fish, a serpent. So in 1 Corinthians 11:15, where the hair is a substitute for the covering. Zodiades Complete Word Studies Dictionary says, auntie, by way of substitution, in place of, instead of, 1 Corinthians 11:15. G.B. Weiner's Grammar of the Idiom of the New Testament. He says that auntie, of which the local meaning is before, in front of, over, against, it denotes figuratively barter, exchange, in which one thing is given for instead of another, and in consequence assumes its place. It governs the genitive, that being the case of exchange. For example, 1 Corinthians 11:15. Her hair for instead of a covering, to serve her as a covering. So when a translation or a lexicon says for or as, it's not talking about some sort of comparison. It's talking about an exchange. For, as, instead of. And as Weiner points out, when one thing is given instead of another, in consequence, it assumes the place of the other. When A is given for B, all that is required is A. When nature has given women their long hair instead of a covering, all that is required is that long hair. I gave you this illustration that is so easy to understand. We could say 4 quarters are given to you for a dollar bill. We could say 4 quarters are given to you as a dollar bill. We could say 4 quarters are given to you instead of a dollar bill. We could say that 4 quarters are given to you in place of a dollar bill. 4 quarters to serve as a dollar bill. In every scenario, the end result is the same. 4 quarters have assumed the place of a dollar bill. When one thing is given ante another, the thing that is given assumes the place of the other. And the thing that is given is all that is required. It's not as if they gave him 4 quarters just as they gave him 4 quarters, so also they got a dollar bill. No, were given 4 quarters ante a dollar bill. I showed you over and over again that Paul did not use a just as, so also language in 1 Corinthians 11:15. Kathos huto. He used it all throughout his epistles, and if Paul had meant, even as nature has given you hair, so also you should wear a veil, he just as well could have used that same language he used over and over again, and he didn't. You know what language he used? He used the language of substitution and replacement. One thing given in the place of another. So the concept applies to hair. Long hair ante a veil is given to her. Long hair for a veil is given to her. Long hair as a veil is given to her. Long hair instead of a veil is given to her. Long hair in place of a veil is given to her. Long hair to serve as a veil is given to her. It doesn't matter how you translate it in any of those scenarios. It's just like the 4 quarters. When one thing is given ante another, the thing that is given takes the place, it assumes the place of the other, as G.B. Weiner in his grammar pointed out. So a woman's long hair assumes the place of the veil, and all that is required of the woman is what has been given to her, and that is her long hair. How much more time do I have left? I want to go back to this because we are talking about the time of prayer. I will therefore that men pray everywhere. In like manner also the women. He connected the women to the prayer. In like manner also the women adorn themselves in modest apparel with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with broided hair. How could you even tell that this woman in the picture has broided hair? How would Paul know that a woman had broided hair? Again, the presence of a prohibition of this hairstyle argues forcibly that it was in fact worn in the churches and it was visibly seen. If they were wearing a veil over their head like this woman in the picture, they would have never been able to see it. Paul wouldn't have had to say anything about a prohibition of women wearing braided hair. The same thing in Peter, written 13 years after Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. 1 Peter 3:3, whose adorning let it not be that outward adorning of plaiting the hair. In this picture, what is that lady's outward adorning? Is her hair her outward adorning? And don't think this is not talking about prayer. Go down to verse 7, 1 Peter 3:7. Prayer is in the entire context of what Paul is saying here. What is her outward adorning? Is it her hair? No, it's not her hair. It's some sort of shawl over her head. But that's not what Peter said. Peter said, whose adorning let it not be the outward adorning of plaiting the hair. How would Paul or Peter know that their hair was plaited if they were fully covered with some kind of veil? How can plaiting the hair be an outward adorning if supposedly Christian women fully covered their heads with a veil? The point is, they didn't. If women went around praying with a veil on their head, then that veil would have been their outward adorning, not the plaiting of the hair. It wouldn't be necessary to warn the women against a particular hairstyle if that hairstyle was being covered by a shawl or a veil. This shows conclusively that apostolic women were not going around praying while wearing veils. Otherwise, why would there be a prohibition against the outward adorning of plaiting the hair? Brother Hayes' proposition is totally denied. 1 Corinthians 11:15, Paul said, a woman's long hair is given to her instead of a veil. All that is required of her is what has been given. When A is given for B, A assumes the place of B, and all that is required is A. Long hair is given to her instead of a veil. Ladies, the real sign of submission is not some sort of shawl you wear over your head. The real sign of submission is getting the scissors out of your hair. Long hair is not a measurement on a tape measure. Long hair is the fact that you don't cut it. If your hair only grows down to the top of your shoulders and you don't cut it, it's long. If your hair grows to the middle of your back, it's long if you don't cut it. If long hair goes to your floor and drags your tracks out, ladies, it's long. The idea is to continually let your hair grow. And that is long hair, long uncut hair is required covering a woman.